In this final segment on worker mobility and migration, I'd like to discuss some current thoughts on migration. Some of these will be informed by just long-term trends that we've observed, and some of them will be informed by particular articles that are posted in Canvas for you to review if you'd like. First, we've talked a little bit about some of the migration trends. We'll talk about that a little bit further. We'll look at push and pull factors affecting immigration. We'll look at wage changes as a result of increased labor supply, and then we'll think about benefiting from investments in migration or immigration. We know that this is part of the human capital equation, of course, as we've talked about in a prior module. First, we know that over time, GDP and migration are positively correlated. By that I mean, if we want to think about changes over time, and we want to look at, say, time in this axis and, say, GDP in this axis, we see that over time GDP has risen dramatically. Now, I'm not being very specific or technical in this country. The slope actually has probably been much greater than that. But this is our GDP slope over time. If we've gone here from, say, 1800 to 2000, this slope is actually rather steep. In fact, it's probably much steeper than that. Well, what has our immigration looked like in that same period? Well, in that same period, if we look on this same y-axis, if we can measure immigration somehow, we would see that if we could normalize it at the same point as GDP, we would actually find that immigration tracks GDP changes very closely. In fact, it's only been in recent years that GDP has risen more rapidly than immigration. So we see the definite and positive correlation between GDP and immigration in our country. We have to think about why that is. One of the reasons is what we talked about in our updated argument, and that is that additional households, additional population, bring about additional demands for goods and services. And those demands for goods and services then are met by increasing labor demands. We see wages rise, we see prices rise, we see GDP rise. And we see them, wages and prices rise moderately enough to feel as though they are efficient for us, they're beneficial for us, but we see GDP rise by a much greater margin. So we have to think about why that is. Well, one of the things we can consider is the fact that when we have more workers in a society with a broader range of ethnic and cultural backgrounds, a broader range of training and exposures, we actually create a more efficient labor market, such that we can have more efficient exchanges and transactions. We have less monopsony. We have less friction in those labor markets. We find that we can motivate more consistent unemployment levels. Think about this for a moment. If we brought up a graph, and I don't have that to show you, but if we brought up a graphic that let us look at unemployment and the changes in unemployment over time, we would see that in this earlier period, and I'll try to kind of model this for you, although it won't be very rigorous. If we see changes in unemployment, if we could normalize unemployment at this same level, we would see that in these earlier periods, we saw much more dramatic swings in unemployment, and that we saw this unemployment really kind of changes level out. We saw some increases, some decreases. Think about it. We saw some pretty wild depressions in these earlier periods. We've seen some recessions even since, of course, but it used to be that recessions, which are coincident with periods of declining employment and increasing unemployment, we know that recessions occurred every 2 to 3 or 4 years in the earlier part of this time frame. But by the time we get to the mid-1900s and the golden age of capitalism, if you will, in the remainder of this time frame, we see that recessions really only occur meaningfully about once every 10 years. And really that change took place after the Great Depression, and as our nation became more able to use fiscal and monetary policy instruments to moderate the effects of inflation and unemployment. Well, if immigration and immigrant labor was as detrimental to our society as some currently are concerned that it might be, then we would see rises in unemployment. We'd see increased changes in unemployment. We would see weakening GDP as immigration rises rather than increasing GDP. So we see some pretty attractive and reasonable arguments as to why immigration and migration generally may be more beneficial for our society than it is detrimental. Let's think about some of the push and pull factors now that motivate migration and immigration. So a push factor is that which would drive someone from their home nation. A push factor might be the political environment of that nation. It might be the economic environment of the nation. Could be maybe the religious environment of the nation, maybe some changes in the religious environments, environment of the nation. Just could be some other social or structural changes. Could be some climatic changes. Maybe there's been drought that are pushing people out of their home nation. It takes a lot to push one out of one's home nation. So immigration is in part motivated by push factors. One needs to be motivated to leave their home nation. It's not good enough to think about where they're going. We have to think about why they're leaving. So there are definite push factors that drive people from their nations. If I am freedom-loving and I live in a part of the world that has gone from being relatively open to somewhat totalitarian, as we've seen in parts of the Middle East, perhaps, and other parts of North Africa, then maybe I have some push to get me out of those nations, and we clearly see that. One of the current tragedies here in 2015 is the number of people leaving North Africa, fleeing North Africa to leave and escape totalitarian regimes, and trying to get to Western and Southern Europe and drowning as their vessels, which they might call boats and you and I might liberally call rafts at best, are sinking and succumbing to waves and weather and such. So those would be push factors, that which causes us to leave our home nation. Well, we have to think separately about where these people are then attracted to go. We've got the motivation to get them to leave their country and a push factor, but what's the motivation to cause them to go to a particular nation? We call those pull factors, or what attracts workers to that location. Well, similarly, each of these issues that we've thought about or talked about for push might be present as pull factors. But they're going to be negative factors when they're push, and they're going to be positive factors when they're pull. So we can think about these as negative factors for push, positive factors for pull, or motivating factors to go somewhere. Political unrest in one nation might be escaped to go to the political openness and freedom of a nation like the United States or Canada or perhaps Great Britain and other parts of Western Europe. The economic condition of the United States and much of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the most highly industrialized, most successful countries economically on our planet, are very attractive to go to those. We rarely see people migrating to nations that are economically disadvantaged, that are economically challenged, or that are politically challenged or socially challenged. We rarely see people going to climates that are harsh, but we in huge numbers, in droves, see people migrating to climates that are pleasant. I mean, it's attractive to go to Florida if you have lived in northern Europe where it's cold and snowy. It's attractive to go to much of the South and western United States in that case. So a push factor pushes you from a home nation, but a pull factor will cause you to be motivated to go to a nation. So keep that in mind when we think about the factors of immigration. We also have to think about wage changes as a result of increased labor supply. So think about this. Let's suppose for a moment that we have domestic low-skilled workers, and we know that they experience some pressure on their wages when we have immigrant workers. We know that most immigrant workers, regardless of their skill level, are treated as though they're relatively low skilled when they arrive here. We've seen situations where individuals with PhDs and that are doctors and that have been lawyers and engineers and such in their home nations will come to the United States, but because of their inability to express themselves well in English and their inability to immediately know or become licensed through the laws of the United States, we know that they become treated as though they're low-skilled workers. And I'm not suggesting that that's unwarranted. In fact, their ability to effectively produce in the United States or the domestic environment now is challenged if they don't understand the language or they've not been able to meet licensing requirements, education requirements, and such. So we see most immigrant workers as being relatively low-skilled, and when we see that, then they put the most pressure on low-skilled or low-income jobs. This is part of why we have seen our unemployment, or excuse me, our minimum wage debate heat up in recent years. Excuse me, where we know that we have the wages have been suppressed at the lowest part of the spectrum because of some of this insurgence or this in-migration of workers, regardless of their skill level, but because they're treated as low-skilled workers. However, immediately we have to think about, well, what's the plight of the low-skilled but English-speaking, well-acculturated, socialized worker in this country? If we have someone that's been on a construction crew, maybe a manual labor on a construction crew, or maybe even a framer on a residential construction crew, these are not highly skilled workers. In fact, we very often see immigrants filling these roles. We see that those that have filled the roles in the past, but that might be domestic workers with good command of the language, good command of the geography, of the social norms, understanding how to deal with the climate, etc., we find that their actual relative value increases. We find that they're able to then become managers or supervisors of some of these crews. Well, not all of them, of course, but some part of them will break out of the very low wage environment that they were in and have opportunities because there are more workers and because there's more labor demanded from these. We find that some of these increases in labor demand because of increases in goods all obviously will then sometimes solve the workers' problems. And we find that mobility solves these workers' problems as well. If I am of a particular skill set and I live in southern Arizona, where there's a fairly significant amount of immigration, some very definite pressures on the Arapahoe County, if you will, labor market because of in-migration from the south of the border. The cost of mobility, if you're already a citizen of the United States, is relatively low. We can escape that market if we'd like to. We can go from that market, let's say, to Chicago or Dallas or Portland or New York City, where clearly immigration and migration also have an effect, but we can fairly inexpensively, fairly fluidly move from one place to another at relatively limited cost. Think about the changes in cost of mobility in recent decades. Even as little as 20 and 40 years ago, it was relatively expensive to move an entire household from, say, rural Utah to Los Angeles, if that was what we wanted to think about, or from Texas to Chicago. The relocation per mile was expensive. The time it took was long. The ability to find a job was challenged. We couldn't just do internet searches for jobs and set up appointments online through Monster.com, etc. Well, now labor mobility is far more fluid. And so if we find workers that become disadvantaged in some of these border areas or some of these areas where we have fairly significant levels of immigration and some pooling of migrant workers, we find that domestic workers will often leave those markets and find yet better opportunities for themselves in other markets around the country. Much of what I've discussed in this segment is really chronicled in an article by Perry that you'll find in your on Canvas under some of the supplemental resources for this module. It's an article written by Giovanni Perry. I believe it is in 2010. And the Perry article is as good an article as I've seen to objectively point out some of the realities of some of the realities of migration and immigration, and have done more than any other article that I've seen in recent years to kind of break some of the myths of immigration. Lastly, and a little bit of this falls into my opinion category, which I'm rarely interested in giving you, but I feel strongly about this one. Lastly, we find that both individual and market level gains take place in our marketplace because of immigration. We have a richer, more culturally diverse marketplace because of immigration. Our nation is not one that was built on a particular social creed, not one that was built on a definite culture. It's been the melding of social creeds, the melding of cultures, the coexistence of religions. More often than not, peaceful coexistence, although not always. We've seen a little bit more of that in recent decades, where some of the coexistence has become less peaceful. But that's more a reflection of other social pressures than it is anything else. We also have to think about this from the standpoint of human capital investment. Think about the tremendous number of foreign students that come into the United States to be educated in this market. And many of them are educated within our public universities. And certainly, they pay a higher amount of tuition. It's part of the reason our public universities and colleges try to attract them. But there's still some state level or federal level support for these students. They benefit from this infrastructure that we've invested in now for many decades. And because of immigration laws, visas, INS codes and such, most of these students, when they receive their diplomas, their bachelor's, master's, maybe even doctoral degrees, most of them simply return to their home nations. In some respects, this is a tremendous waste of investment. In fact, it's maybe a waste of human capital resource for the United States. If I had it my way, when somebody came to this country, especially if they paid their own way through their education, paid their own way through their education in this country, then when they received their higher education diploma, stapled to it would be a green card, allowing them, perhaps even inviting them to stay. And I say that not because I'm a liberal, because those of you that might know me a little bit know that I'm almost anything but I say that because it simply makes pragmatic sense. Look at the trends and trajectories of how our nation, our incomes, our productivities, our GDP gains, our lifestyles have been built. They have been built on human capital investments seen through immigration and education more than anything else. And if we can keep those immigrants here and keep the additional productivity, we have that much more opportunity to innovate, that much more opportunity to then express our exports and have value-added goods and services that we can provide the world over.